Right, and the rest of this will be in English because our guest of honor today, Erik Heinze, has just come in from London, University of London, and will give a keynote lecture today. Free speech faces unprecedented threats as trust in government, media, and universities erodes. Voices on the left as well on the right are abandoning faith in open debate, undermining the culture sustaining liberal democracy. Europe has expanded speech restrictions, whilst the US is witnessing cancel culture on the left alongside crackdowns on the right. Universities face powerful ideological pressures from both sides of the political spectrum. Tech monopolies compound the problem, controlling digital discourse through opaque moderation policies and the role as private gatekeepers over public speech. How is Norway affected by these big trends? And how do we rebuild trust and protect free speech in the face of these threats? To discuss these questions, we here at Civita have invited Professor Erik Heinze, a world-leading expert on free speech, to Oslo. We also have Professor Kjersti Torbjørnsrud, research professor at the Institute for Social Research, and Civitas Skjalg Stokke Haugen. So what we'll do this evening is that Erik will start by giving a talk about the state of free speech, and he's going to spend around 30 minutes doing that, or maybe a little less, depending. And after that, Kjersti and Skjalg will have a few comments to Erik's talk, and then we'll open the room for debate, comments, questions, etc. Erik Heinze is professor at Queen Mary University in London, where he co-founded and currently directs the Center for Law, Democracy and Society. His most recent book, Coming Clean: The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left, argues that political progressives have insisted on critical understandings of Western history, but have failed to apply the same methods to the histories of the left itself. His previous book before that had the title The Most Human Right: Why Free Speech is Everything. It was published in 2022, also by the MIT Press, I think. Yeah. And he has published a number of other important books on free speech and other aspects of human rights. His opinion pieces have appeared in a number of newspapers like the Guardian, the Independent, the Washington Post, etc. And I think I'll just leave it to you from here, Erik. So the floor is yours.
Well, I consider this good luck. I'm spilling water right and left tonight. Thank you very much, Taco, and thank you to those of you who have come, taken the trouble to come in this bitter cold this evening, to which I'm very ill-accustomed, I must confess. But it's lovely to be back at Civitas. I've always enjoyed our cooperation and exchanges, and I certainly hope they'll continue. And I think, if I had come here, or pretty much anywhere, maybe about 10 years ago, to give a talk with a title like this, I think I would have just jumped right in and just started talking about free speech. In other words, I would have assumed the background of liberal democracy to be more or less secure. Okay, maybe even 15 years ago, we'll say. 10 years ago, things were already starting to become shaky. But and I don't think I'm alone in this respect. I think there were so many ways in which we were simply taking liberal democracy for granted. Yes, of course, it always has its problems. Democracy is kind of made for problems, and yet, nevertheless, we can rely on a certain bedrock. And of course, now this seems, right, as Tarkle has already intimated, this seems ever less to be the case. With, I think, some people seriously wondering what will be meaning by democracy or liberal democracy perhaps 10 or 20 years from now. I think we're becoming increasingly nervous about that. And because I think free speech is the defining feature of liberal democracy, in a sense, you can't just assume a background of liberal democracy and start talking about free speech in such a carefree way as you might have done a decade or two ago. But I'll do my best. Concept of liberal democracy. I mean, part of the reason why we've taken it for granted for so long and seen it almost as an unproblematical idea goes back to the fact that it's amazing how much, not only in public discourse, but even in scholarly discourse, the term liberal democracy is used as a unified whole. Right? When in fact, the histories of both liberalism and democracy suggest a very fraught relationship between the two, right? On the one hand, going back to ancient Greece, going back to Plato and Aristotle, there's always been a consciousness, of the danger of what we today would call populism or tyranny of the majority, right? The idea that you could have too much democracy. Right, this was certainly an idea that both Plato and Aristotle shared, despite their many disagreements. And today, a kind of Trumpian populism, seems to put the idea of liberal democracy at risk. And so there's always been a way in which democracy is seen to be in tension with individual freedom. And the other way around, there's always been ways in which individual freedom has been in tension with democracy, right? Now, this is quite interesting, I think. We tend to group people like Musk and Trump together, but in some ways they represent dangers at the two opposite poles of liberalism and democracy, right? Because another worry about a liberal democracy has always been that you can also have too much individual freedom, right? Of course, this is the famous critique of Karl Marx, who was certainly committed to collective self-government, to a kind of democracy, but saw liberalism as the great danger, right? Too much freedom, but Marx was not the first. Again, Plato and Aristotle saw this as well. Rousseau saw this as well. And so we've always had these two strands of suspicion, right? Democracy might be dangerous for individual liberty, or too much individual liberty might be dangerous for democracy. So these have always been in tension, these concepts of liberalism and democracy, of individual freedom and collective self-government. And so the fact that in recent decades we've just kind of casually talked about certain values as liberal democratic might suggest that and again you see this in sort of European Court of Human Rights and Bundesverfassungsgericht, it's quite common just to throw them together. And this might actually already hint at some of the difficulties we're facing now, that we've never taken sufficiently seriously the tensions inherent. And I think this bears on the ways in which we approach free speech, and that's what I'm going to try to explain. On the one hand, we've had a kind of, in more recent decades, sort of since World War II, a certain liberal strand, people like Isaiah Berlin or John Rawls, who I find very worrying, although very few people point this out, in the sense that they place individual freedom as the kind of essential or defining political value, to the extent that they see democracy as just kind of a way to get there. Almost as if, well, if we could find another way, we would use that. Right? So that democracy ends up being quite subordinated to liberalism. And I think that is deeply worrying. It has been a deeply worrying strand in liberal thought and not sufficiently acknowledged. And so I don't like that. On the other hand, you have someone like Jürgen Habermas, to whom I'm a bit more sympathetic, who inverts that relationship, right? Certainly dedicated to individual freedom, but much more interested in how can that be in the service of democracy, rather than asking how democracy can be in the service of freedom. When we're asking about democracy in the service of freedom, I think we're really instrumentalizing democracy. Whereas when we're asking about freedom in the service of democracy, we're keeping central the system that makes all the rest possible if you believe in democracy. So that's going to be how I'm going to proceed for the rest of this talk, is very much on the idea that we have failed to keep democracy at the center, even when we think we do, and or when we're just kind of talking about the liberal democratic system or set of values as if this were an unproblematical relationship. And so I think a very good way to test liberal democracy, and a difficult way to test it, is by looking at how democracy, in a sense, deals with its opposite. And again, this problem has been around forever. How does democracy deal with ideas that are fundamentally anti-democratic? Or how does liberal democracy deal with ideas that are fundamentally anti-democratic or anti-liberal? These are all related ideas. So a couple of samples. This has been a very influential passage from the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination from 1965. It's an international multilateral treaty with a great number of state signatories. It's been one of the most influential of international human rights documents. And in Article 4, we read, states parties shall declare an offense punishable by law all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, incitement to racial discrimination, and etc. Now, I cite this as one example because most Western democracies adhere to it to some extent. They all do it differently, but most Western democracies to some extent have incorporated the idea of such a punishment into their criminal law, or in some cases civil law. Shortly after the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination came in short order another of the most influential international human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966, which says any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So notice an expansion, right? Starting in 1965 with race, now categories of national, racial, or religious belonging. And of course, if we look at much of the work on hate speech today, you can easily count more than 10 categories. And I mean, particularly within the the Council of Europe. There's one document from 2015 which enumerates 14 categories and allows for more to be added, right? So there's been a great expansion. Right now, how does this test, so how does this kind of development, how do such laws put liberal democracy to a test? Now here I would distinguish, sorry, this is a bit nerdy, this point, but you kind of have to do it. I would distinguish between individualized and generalized expression. What do I mean by that? Pretty much all democracies, as far as I can tell, in fact, probably pretty much all countries, have some kind of law which make it illegal to sort of directly, verbally harass someone, even if you're not touching them. Yeah, verbally harass them, verbally insult them, right? Every country does it in its own way, but I'm not aware of any country that doesn't have a law, such a law, at least on the books. Enforcement, okay, that's always another question. Incidentally, including the United States, right? Right, there's this perennial misperception that in the United States, you have a right to say anything. Of course, this has never been true under American law. I'll be getting back to that a bit later. And certainly as to kind of what you could call individualized hate speech or individualized insults, harassment, targeting, and so forth, that actually is not constitutionally protected in the United States. And as far as I know, it's not protected anywhere, although the contours might be defined differently from one jurisdiction to the next. Therefore, what I consider to be crucial is the problem of what we could call generalized expression. In other words, the speaker who gets up and doesn't target anyone, doesn't harass anyone individually, doesn't start hurling insults, right? But nevertheless starts expounding some sort of theory or some sort of ideas that are racist, or again, we know the whole long list, that are sexist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, whatever it might be. Yeah? This is where the real controversy has come from. As far as I can tell, again, in pretty much any Western democracy nowadays, and not only Western, you'll find these sorts of disputes going on about should so-and-so be allowed to speak? Such and such ideas in purely generalized ways, right? Simply a theory of race, or a theory about the Jews, or a theory about Muslims, or whatever it might be, or about women, whatever it might be. And of course, this is what I would call an essential problem for liberal democracy, because again, the question is it ever legitimate for a liberal democracy to ban the purely general expression of any idea, however abhorrent? When may a democracy legitimately ban the expression of an idea based on viewpoint selective grounds? In other words, based solely on the philosophy which the speaker is presenting. Is that ever legitimate to do? Again, once we just accept that kind of individualized insults, okay, we're not going to protect those. Some people would protect even those, but I would say it's a minority. And so, in order to answer this question, right, is it ever legitimate for a liberal democracy to ban the general expression of ideas, of an idea, solely on the grounds of the philosophy, the worldview it's presenting, usually a view about different groups of people? Then the question is usually, well, does it cause harm? Which ends up with the question, well, what do we mean by harm? What counts as harm, right? And this, again, another question which goes back centuries. And so unsurprisingly, we can find different sorts of answers to the question about when is speech harmful. One answer we could call classically liberal, right? I have to, civitas, I kind of have to start with that one, right? The one we could call the kind of classically liberal answer to this question, when is speech harmful? The classically liberal model is distinctive in finding what I'll call a significant distinction between communication and conduct, right? So under the classical liberal understanding, a bad idea is not the same as a punch in the face, right? On the other hand, a bad idea might, under certain circumstances, lead to harm. And then the question is, well, how close does that relationship, that causation, have to be? This is a kind of the classical liberal way of going about answering the question. So here's a famous, I told you, I promised I would get back to the United States. So here's one of the most famous answers to this question. This was a case from 1969, United States Supreme Court, called Brandenburg versus Ohio, where the court famously, I'm simplifying here, by the way, but it'll be good enough for our purposes, where the court set a standard. It says, in order to understand the harm of speech, actually harm is about risk. How likely is something dangerous or violent or damaging to happen? And so the court said there has to be a risk of imminent lawless action. They added other ingredients, but again, that's enough for us for now. And this is what happened in that case. Basically, this is kind of a farm in rural Ohio, and you had KKK, Ku Klux Klan members gathering at a little meeting, and one of them, this Mr. Brandenburg, gave a typical kind of Ku Klux Klan speech about, the blacks and the Jews and the whole, right, the whole panoply of undesirables. And it just so happened this was infiltrated by a local news reporter who got it on film. And so then it was, it was shown to the public. And then at that point, a lawsuit was brought under an Ohio law which would have prohibited such speech. And it was at this point that the U.S. Supreme Court, said, there was never any, these people, I'm going to simplify. Obviously, they used a rather more elevated language. But essentially what the court said, what these people said might have been dumb and dangerous. But there was no risk that anything further was that any of this was going to carry on into action. And this is what they had in mind. Again, it's a rural area. It's a farmland in Ohio, right? So there was no kind of crowd of people that they were going to attack, right? This is what the court had in mind. It was just people talking bullshit to each other, right? As happens among humans, right? That's the court didn't put it that way, but that's basically what the court said. Now, this is quite significant because nowadays people tend to see the United States jurisprudence of free speech as kind of conservative, right-wing, and it's been very much claimed by the conservatives ever since the Reagan years. In fact, this was among the most liberal, liberal in the American sense, among the most progressive courts that the United States had ever had. This was the court, 3 years later that would rule that women had a right to abortion. A few years earlier, right to contraception, rights in criminal procedure. This was the most progressive and active, judicially active court in the court's history, right? And this was also a response to the fact, in the previous decade of McCarthyism, that people, right, because there had been some McCarthyite cases before the court in the previous decade, and this case is essentially a response to McCarthyism. It was saying, we can't be locking people up for their dumb ideas. And so I think, so what they said is, so in other words, what they imagined is, okay, the state can intervene, right? You have a crowd of people, and, right, fine, if, it looks like their speech is about to, is being used to mobilize them to, attack another group of people, or to start, engaging in vandalism, or what have you. Okay, then the state can intervene. But we need some evidence of this, right? Right? It can't be the ideas alone. And I think that was about as close as we get in the jurisprudence to what you could call a classical liberalism, a classically liberal position, right? So a significant distinction. It's not absolute. They do see that sometimes speech can lead directly, kind of irreversibly to harm, but they set a high threshold. And this is why I think it's in many ways we could call a classical liberal decision. But of course, there's a problem with this solution, which is that today, right? That was 1969. Today, in the age of the internet, risk works very differently. Now we have much more evidence that, the internet is not a little farmland remote in Ohio, that someone's, sitting in their pajamas at 3 in the morning typing away can actually cause mass death. Here's a second model. You could call it a communitarian model. What I mean by that is you've got another group of people who see a much weaker distinction between communication and conduct, and who are much more likely to see vicious speech as vicious conduct, vicious speech as kind of more like the punch in the nose, and who say, yes, of course, it's not physical in the way a punch in the face may be, but nevertheless, it hurts and it harms. It is a kind of violence, even if it's not a material violence, right? So communitarians, and this is an umbrella term, all sorts of people think this who don't necessarily share other political ideas. But this would be, I would say, a mark of this idea. There's a very weak distinction between community. In other words, it's a fluid border between the two. And this, you find there are some liberals who think this. Jeremy Waldron would be the stellar example. He does think this, even though he's otherwise, a dyed-in-the-wool liberal in pretty much all of his other positions. And I could name others. German militant democracy has long taken this view, has been much more willing to see certain types of speech as dangerous in itself. Right, through a history which we all know all too well. Critical theorists, a lot of more kind of progressively minded theorists. This idea has been dominant now for certainly since the 1980s, right? So for virtually almost coming on to a half a century. So you have a lot of people who adhere to this idea. Now the problem with this communitarian model is that, first of all, it's excessively proactive, right? In other words, it really would toss into prison people, where there's not a hint of evidence that anybody was ever going to act on it, right? In other words, it gets us back to this kind of 1965 declaration that the idea in itself is grounds for punishment, right? So it's excessively proactive. In other words, it just stipulates that that the speech is harmful, in ways that kind of become ideological, and therefore selective. Because let's say if you were to lock up everybody who has potentially dangerous ideas, I'm not sure how many of us would be left. And so you end up with very political selections. Basically, the communitarian model is kind of just a way to punish people for having the wrong ideology, and in ways that are quite selective. And so, whoa, what have I done? I have to stop fidgeting. Hold on a minute, sorry. Let's go back. Oh my. Okay, sorry about that. Oh, okay, I've broken, hold on a second. I've broken the it's now just doing page by page instead of line by line. Oh, I have to go back onto the, right. Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. That should be good. Sorry, everybody. That's what happens when I start talking with my hands too much. All right. Okay, here's a third model. We'll call this a libertarian model, which sees a very strong distinction, right? So it goes further than the classically liberal, which sees a significant, right? A libertarian model makes the strongest possible distinction. So it's at the other end from communitarianism, right? It makes the strongest possible distinction between generalized communication and conduct. Basically, for a libertarian, unless you can literally show some sort of physical or material harm or financial harm, unless you can literally show harm which is more than just offense, then speech should never be subject to any kind of civil or criminal sanction. And the problem here is that the libertarian right, it's excessively retroactive, right? It's quite the contrary problem to that of the communitarian, right? In other words, it waits for the harm to happen. It waits for the harm to happen and then it punishes it, right? And so it basically says to the state, you're never allowed to make even very reliable risk assessments. Right? And again, in the age of the internet, again, before the internet, I would say the kind of Brandenburg and the they were not so far apart, just because, this kind of scenario rarely happened. It happened, but so they were much closer together. Now, in the age of the internet, the classical liberal model and the libertarian model, I think, are quite different. Right, just because risk means something fundamentally different in the age of the internet, and I think libertarians have not woken up to this. As much as I love them for other reasons, once again, if I had been discussing all of this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I might have just stopped here. Nowadays, I kind of feel I have to introduce another model. Just because we see it happening, even in, in nominally democratic societies, right? An authoritarian model, which I would say draws tactical, strategic distinctions, right? In other words, if it's in the interests of whoever is in power to call speech harmful, they're going to call it harmful. No matter how much they talk about free speech, you all know who I'm talking about, right? So it's all just going to be done in the interests of power. That's kind of authoritarianism, right? And of course, here the problem is just falsification of risk, right? It's not being proactive or retroactive or anything else. It's just lying. So I see something interesting about, the first three models, something that we can learn from them, but I also see problems with each of them. And this is why, again, going back to my kind of Habermas democracy idea, not that I agree with Habermas on all this, I think he also runs into problems, by the way. But I'm wondering if we can come up with a more distinctively democratic or liberal democratic, but again with democracy back at the center of our concern. And here's how I do it. You see, one of the problems with human rights, although as Tuckle says, I've been kind of sticking my nose into human rights for a good part of my career, but always rather uneasy. Because human rights, they tend to, as important as they are for democracy, right, have a tendency just to take on a life of their own. And then to become just kind of judges doing democracy for us. And I think that's a real problem. And so what I propose instead is understanding democracy from the point of view of citizenship, of the democratic citizen. What is necessary for the very possibility of being a democratic citizen? So, for example, criminal law, criminal procedure is gives us good analogies because criminal procedure differs wildly from one democracy to the next. Even democracies otherwise similar. In the Netherlands and Belgium, you'll find very, very different forms of criminal procedure, or Belgium, France, Switzerland, and so forth. It's just because, these cultures of criminal procedure, they evolve locally over centuries, and yet, so I think that's a great example. In other words, it's one of those places where you might point to and say, you can't really talk about democracy with a big D. Every democracy is different. And here's I say, no. So it might be true that every democracy does criminal procedure differently, and yet there's just no way in which a society could be democratic if there were no protections at all, if the police could just round you up and toss you into prison. Right? Or if standards fell below any recognizable understanding of what would be fairness in procedure. And so you might say one part of the core of citizen is some minimum of protections in criminal processes. Another one would be decisive political participation, which usually just means a right to vote. Something like a right to vote. If you don't have that, it's hard to say how it's a democracy. It might be a nice place in other ways, right? You know, people like to use this word consultation, you know, as if that's kind of the same as democracy. Well, it's not, right? Democracy would be some sort of guarantee to every citizen for participation. And so, having come to the conclusion, yeah, there is such thing as a core of democratic citizenship, an absolute minimum, then the question I ask is, okay, then how much free speech is necessary to the very possibility of participating in a democracy? And this is where I really part company with, the kind of libertarians. Because libertarians, they don't even ask this question. Libertarians is, there's speech somewhere and should it be protected? Now, I think in the online world, this is a big problem. In other words, some machine is talking, it doesn't know what it's saying because it doesn't know anything. And libertarians would protect that just as much as they would protect the speech of you and me. I'm not saying I would not protect such speech. But it is not speech which is in any way germane to the core of citizenship, right? You can arrest me, you can't arrest that machine. The police can confiscate the machine, but they don't arrest it. That machine doesn't vote. That machine is not placed on trial and so forth. That machine is not a citizen. And so I'm not asking, right? And so I think too much of the problem with some of the classically liberal or the libertarian is they're just looking at speech as if it just kind of floats around out there, right? And then asking, should we regulate it or not? I just think that's the wrong question. For me, the question is, right, above all, if we are going to look at the speech that must most preciously be protected, what is inherent to the core of citizenship? Oh, sorry. I missed a bit here, right? And so I define this as, so to answer that question, how much speech is necessary to the core of citizenship, the answer I give is what I call viewpoint absolutism constrained by risk. Now, what I mean is this. Again, on the kind of more libertarian side of the spectrum, you start getting more and more talk about what is sometimes called free speech absolutism. Again, the kind of cartoon that people have of the American system, although of course that's not true at all. Right? You get to say anything, right? Now, of course, again, even in American law, let alone that of other democracies, there's no such thing as free speech absolutism. No legal system would last more than a few hours with free speech absolutism. I can explain that later if you want. Instead, the term that I use is viewpoint absolutism, again, that no one should be excluded from the democratic conversation solely on the grounds of having the wrong philosophy, having the wrong outlook. Right? Some types of speech clearly can be punished, such as perjury in court, or graffiti, and so forth. Right? So, even libertarians will go along with some of those, such as graffiti, because for them property is kind of the ultimate right. But right. But my idea is that it's right. It's the worldview that you're bringing to the democratic conversation, however abhorrent, however hideous it might be, right? Right, cannot be criminalized or otherwise legally sanctioned, right? Right. We were talking briefly before about academic freedom, and this is my view of the academy as well. And I think universities have been the worst performers because they have different ways of banning even perfectly legal speech. I think universities have been the worst culprits if we care about free speech within a democratic optic. And so, just to recap, right? If we want to know how to regulate online speech, of course, I'm not going to go into every detail. That would take months. But my point of departure is that certainly generative AI, it doesn't, it just has nothing to do with core of citizenship. Much of it might be quite valuable. Let's face it, we all use it. You know, I don't want to take it away from me either. But again, it doesn't vote. Moreover, I think even more importantly, if we look at the reality of generative, I don't know what the reality will be 20 years from now, but when people say, well, should we regulate or how should we regulate, Elon Musk, it's as if the default would be not regulating that sphere of speech. That sphere of speech is already heavily regulated. No one regulates speech more than Elon Musk himself. So the question is not do we regulate it or not, it's simply do we have a say in it being regulated? So here, I think if we take this democratic approach, everything flips. So it's democratic, I'm arguing, essentially to leave individual citizens, actual human beings, alone, but to engage the regulation of the online sphere, because that's regulated anyway. And then the only question is, how much do we get to participate in that regulation, right? Should it be us or should it be Musk? Which is more democratic? Particularly when we, let's remember that someone like Elon Musk has more power over the public sphere than most governments, than virtually all governments. Which is why within major platforms there's no such thing as unregulated sites. Again, that might be different 20 years from now. It's just that I don't yet see how that would be. And in addition, there would be no such thing, I would argue, as an independent listener's right, because this is often argued by those who want to protect, even Elon Musk, saying, well, maybe no right attaches to a speaker because there is no speaker, but there is the listener's right. And, well, my answer to that is, well, where would that stop, right? I mean, does that mean, that we get rid of defamation law? Or indeed, courtroom perjury law, right? Because someone has a right to hear it. Yeah, that's just kind of a dumb argument, if you don't mind my saying so. It's just that it comes up, surprisingly frequently, so I thought I'd have to toss it in. Anyway, we can talk about it more if you're not convinced. And so basically, just to kind of, because I think I'm kind of running, how am I doing? Anyway, oh, okay, I'm doing better than I thought. Well, in that case, maybe I'll take it. So I think that basically, the kind of big scheme I'm looking at, it kind of goes like this. Again, going back 15 or 20 years ago, I was always very much an opponent of the existing hate speech laws, in Germany and France, wherever, because again, they were basically punishing people purely for their worldviews. However hard those worldviews were, that was never my disagreement. And I still hold that position. That position I have not changed at all. I don't think government should be going after citizens, live individual speakers. On the other hand, again, I think it's quite false to extrapolate from that premise to the idea that we don't regulate or that we minimally regulate the internet. There I would say things entirely flip, and that we actually democratize by regulating the internet, at least the internet as it is today. And incidentally, I don't mean, your own little homemade site. I mean the major platforms. I just mean the major platforms, the ones that, again, are more powerful than governments. As to your little homemade site, I would treat that like you. That, I would say, is part of your own core of citizenship. Okay? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Now, I was going to kind of sum this all up in a graph, but maybe I won't do that because I think I've gotten the basic ideas across. And the more I think about it, the more I have the impression that this might be really boring, right? So I'll simply wind up by saying that if this has at least tickled your interest a bit, and you're interested in the more nerdy type of read, I kind of wrote some of these ideas in a recent article in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies, but I haven't stopped yet. I'm still trying to figure out what I think on some of this stuff. Or for a more general overview, Torkel mentioned this book with the MIT Press, which came out a few years ago. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.